Thanks for watching the video. This is Pascal for EMP Reviews. This is a synopsis and review of Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, my favorite anime of all time. The review will start at the time posted here. Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust was directed by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, who also wrote the screenplay. Kawajiri also directed the epics Ninja Scroll, Wicked City, and is presently in pre-production for a sequel to Ninja Scroll. Bloodlust was produced by Mata Yamamoto, released in Japanese theaters on April 21, 2001, and was produced by Madhouse Animation Studio. The film is based on the novel Vampire Hunter D, written by Hideyuki Kikuchi. In my video for Evangelion Thrice Upon a Time, I described my love for that film and some of the issues I found with it. I am applying the same process here for Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. I absolutely love this movie, and any criticism in this essay is just an objective approach to this work of art that still holds up to this day. The opening scene shows the abduction of Charlotte Elborn. The kidnapper is implied to be of vampire origins, as he bears no reflection in a nearby mirror during the abduction. Charlotte's father, John Elborn, hires Dee to bring his daughter back to the family, but to kill her if she has been turned by her vampire abductor, in spite of her brother's upset reaction at this idea. He already hired other hunters, the Marcus brothers, for the same task. That night, the brothers come across a village infested with turned people. They easily wipe out the infestation, coincidentally meeting Dee in the process. He himself leaves the area, and soon after, the only woman in the gang, Layla, chases after him. Dee is aided by another personality attached to his body, a face inhabiting his left hand, usually filled with advice and sarcasm. It also helps in determining the location of Charlotte and her abductor, whom it refers to as the Noble. Dee finds his hideout, a giant cube with a reflective slick surface. Dee tricks the automatic defense system in order to get close to the structure and uses his hand's abilities to search for a hidden door. As the sun is setting, Leela suddenly appears at full speed, triggering the defense system once more. The concealed door opens and the Noble and Charlotte rush out in his carriage. Leela attacks, but is injured in the process and loses consciousness. Link and Dee have a confrontation, but the hunter's attention is diverted when he hears Charlotte's concerns for him. Dee returns to his horse, located near the injured Layla. Instead of feeding on her as suggested by his hand, considering her incapacitated state, Dee treats her wounds, an act not met with gratitude when she wakes. Later, the rest of the brothers come across what appears to be the Noble's carriage, motionless. They attack it, discovering that it was a deception, a trick by one member of the Barbaroi, a group hired by Marlink to protect him and Charlotte from hunters. Bengay uses shadows for his tricks, and in this scene manages to kill Nolt Marcus. Dee walks into the Barbaroi's dwelling and meets their elder. He demands to take Charlotte back to her family. The elder refuses, especially considering the large amount of funds they were paid for their services. He then declares that Dee cannot be allowed to leave the compound alive. In the Marcus brothers' reinforced vehicle, Grove is being put under medically in order to initiate his special ghost-like abilities. As Dee and the elder continue to argue, the apparition of Grove flies towards them and the rest of the Barbaroi, firing mystical projectiles at all of them, killing some of the clan members. Dee slices the ghost figure in half, prompting Grove to wake up back in the vehicle, apparently having a seizure as a result. Dee regains pursuit of what he thinks is Marlink's carriage, but it's another one of Bengay's illusions, and it almost gets Dee killed, as it does with his horse. It then engulfs Dee, putting him in an almost comatose state. The Marcus brothers appear and fire at the carriage. a Barbaroid woman, Carolyn, uses her unusual supernatural abilities to cause the vehicle to crash. In the meantime, Dee's hand gets him out of Bengay's blackness, who himself is eventually killed by Kyle Marcus. Later, Kyle and Leela get gas from a nearby village. Leela, in an antagonistic manner, informs the local law that Dee is coming. She informs them that he is a dreaded Dhampir, a half-human, a half-vampire being. As a result, these men find Dee and attempt to stop a local merchant who was in the process of selling him a horse. Armed with a rather large weapon, the dealer forces the man to back down, citing the fact that Dee saved him and 9 other children decades ago from vampire kidnappers, only to be persecuted as a half-breed from the villagers once he returned the kids. In the next scene, the carriage is standing still, guarded by 2 Barbaroi, Carolyn and Machira. While Charlotte went about to take a walk, Dee approaches her. She then tells him that she's in love with Meyer, a statement that infuriates Leila, who also appears. Leila declares that Meyer has killed many people, orders Dee to stay away, and then is attacked by Carolyn. Carolyn and Dee battle, while Machira takes Charlotte away. Dee is almost overcome by sunlight, as he had not previously taken a required period to recover from sun exposure, a limitation of being a half-breed. Nonetheless, he decapitates his opponent, who even in the state is only momentarily defeated. Leila finds Dee extremely weakened and finishes his efforts to bury himself for recovery. Carolyn surfaces again and engages Leila, but is struck by lightning as a storm was coming. While crossing a bridge, the carriage is stopped in its tracks by explosives set by the brothers. Borgoff declares that more explosives are positioned much closer to the vehicle and that he is prepared to set them off. Machira attacks anyhow and is struck down by Borgoff. Kyle forces Charlotte out of the carriage, and soon after Link steps out in desperation to get her, risking his life from exposure to the sunlight. Machira resurfaces in full wolf form, kills Kyle's and injures Borgoff, who activates the explosives. Before Machira reappeared, he had repositioned the explosives to the water below, where the unsuspecting Borgoff was now jumping into. Miraculously, he survives the detonation. The carriage is now back on its way to Chaith Castle, its destination, and inside the coach the scarred Meyer Link resists himself from feeding on Charlotte's blood. Meanwhile, Leila and Borgoff refuse the suggestion by Grove to give up this bounty, considering what's happened and the extremely dangerous idea of going to Chaith Castle, something Kyle also described moments before the events on the bridge. While on the way there, Dee's hand describes the bloody acts perpetrated by the present owner of the castle, Carmilla, 5,000 years before, resulting with the ruling vampire king at the time killing her himself. The castle is so cursed that even elite vampire avoid it. The carriage arrives at the castle with Carmilla at its main door. Meanwhile, Dee kills Machira. Carmilla greets Meyer and Charlotte, conveying her appreciation for their difficulties in getting there and the love the two share. She shows them the rocket that she describes will take them to the city of the night. Sometime later, Meyer again fights an urge to turn Charlotte, which again upsets her, but he describes the curse as a thirst that turns him into an animal. He leaves her, sensing that Dee was approaching. The remaining Marcus brothers also arrive at the castle. Link prepares for a confrontation with the hunter, but instead runs into Charlotte standing close to him, who claims that she wants to return home. Upset, he doesn't see an incoming axe which hacks him in half. He falls, seemingly dead, and doesn't see that Dee here is actually a colony of bats. Meanwhile, the real Charlotte is hypnotized by an illusion of Meyer Link. The real Hunter D enters the castle and begins his search for the couple. In spite of more warnings by Grove, Leila and Borgoff do the same and separate from each other. Dee meets someone who claims to be his mother. She discusses her birth of him and her actions afterwards. More hallucinations are used on Borgoff which get him killed, and Leela sees herself as a much younger child soon after losing her parents. For her, however, Dee interferes right before she is done for, having himself killed the woman in his illusion. Carmilla reveals herself to them, declares that his defeat of her illusions is nothing to rejoice, laughs, and also leaves the area by flying away as a colony of bats, the same group that has been following all of these individuals since the beginning of this story. Borgoff suddenly appears, turned by Carmilla, attacks Dee and forcibly holds Leela. She is saved by Grove's apparition, who kills him and consequently himself, since no one was monitoring his status back in the vehicle. The false Meyer Link feeds on Charlotte's blood. The real state of Carmilla is revealed to be a corpse, sporting the sword that was presumably used to kill her. A bulk of energy appears in front of Dee, described by his hand as emanating from Carmilla. Charlotte's fluids are drawn towards Carmilla's remains, while Link revives himself. Dee is now inside the energy and is attacked by the Queen's apparition in there, who expresses her confusion for his values towards humans. Meanwhile, the sword is thrown out of her body's remains. Dee expresses that her views on the state of vampires are outdated, and she responds by claiming that she will awaken his true nature. Her bloody carcass climbs out of its coffin, while Dee breaks out of her hold and kills her apparition. Carmilla's body cadaver desperately reaches for Charlotte's body, but is decimated by Meyer Link. As a result of the Queen's death, the castle begins to fall apart. Dee approaches Link and Charlotte, and the noble states that he is convinced one day Dee will begin to feed on humans. Dee responds by saying that when that day comes, he will then be the one who is hunted. The two then fight, and Dee deliberately only injures him. He takes Charlotte's ring and declares that he will present that to her family as proof that she is gone. The castle is in ruins as the rocket launches with difficulty, but eventually achieves its necessary atmospheric height. Decades later, Dee attends Leela's funeral, she now being deceased due to old age. With an appearance unaffected by age, he is approached by her granddaughter, who apparently had been told about him along with the rest of the village. The film ends with one final snide remark by his hand. Clearly, Carmilla Bathory, or who Vampire Hunter D fandom calls Carmilla Elizabeth Bathory, is modeled after Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess who tortured and murdered hundreds of young women in the 16th and 17th centuries as a means to maintain her youth. Although clearly Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust does not take place in that historical area, considering the Wild West kind of setting seen in some scenes. I love Carmilla's powers of illusion, as she didn't even know what her victims saw in their trance. It made me think of Wanda Maximoff's first appearance in the Marvel Universe in Avengers Age of Ultron, when she still had her foreign accent. She induced illusions in the minds of Thor, Captain America, and Black Widow. I really miss that version of that character, that is, once she became part of the team, as she was great in Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. I know that she was a villain at times in the Marvel books, but in WandaVision and Doctor Strange, it's really a disappointing evolution of that character. Absolutely amazing design for this villain. I can't think of any other such elaborate appearance for a queen in any form of entertainment. Someone that could possibly be compared is maybe the golden skinned queen Aisha from Guardians of the Galaxy 2, whose motif set a new precedent of sorts when both costume designers and set designers had to work together, since her head was connected to her oversized throne. The scene where Charlotte supposedly wants to return home is perfect because it was right after she and Link had a major disagreement, so it fits right into the narrative. It puts him off his guard to be consequently chopped in half. The castle is amazing. The walls, the rooms, The structure itself is remarkable. For some shots, it does appear like some 3D renderings were used, and this is 1999, so still in a relatively early time in the use of computer imaging. Mario Link's cape as a sword is fantastic, certainly nothing I've ever seen before, and accentuates the nobility he carries as a character, though I don't know how it or D's sword could generate heat during the final battle. Nonetheless, it does look cool. Every frame has an amazing amount of art. Each cell contains what I love, which is, in most instances, 3 shades of colors. As much as I love movies like Atlantis, Treasure Planet, and even Metropolis from 2001, they either use no shading, 2 shades, or a mixture of both inconsistently. But it's certainly nothing I'm going to hold against a masterpiece like Akira, for example, which not only had many scenes with the full 24 frames per second, but had lip positioning animation, not something that is a required standard in the overall category of anime. Machira is probably the most unusual design for a werewolf, certainly more evidence of Madhouse Studios' skill set. And his handling of the explosives on the bridge is definitely as a result of ingenious writing. The opera compositions in here are amazing. Myself, I started to appreciate the artistry involved in creating scores for anime with my obsession for Evangelion. Between that franchise and this movie, the energy put into the music really gets my attention during intense situations and the final act. Composer Marco D'Ambrosio also created music for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure 1993 and the Phantom Blood movie. I hadn't realized until rewatching the film again that when Mario Link was in a carriage and stopped himself from feeding on Charlotte, not only was he fighting the urge to feed on her, to turn her into a vampire, and turning people is certainly a traditional vampire trait, but feeding on Charlotte, that is feeding on her blood, would have accelerated his healing. And by restraining all of these urges, he showed his dedication and his love for her. Layla's mother was kidnapped by vampires. Her father went out to try to get her back and instead got himself killed, and I wonder why the vampires he found with his wife did not turn him and instead murdered him. In any case, her mother returned after being transformed. All of these events are very scarring for a child, especially after the villagers stoned her to death in front of Layla since they feared what she became. The result of this trauma is definitely motivation for her work as a hunter and her anger towards Charlotte. Dee's motivation for the capture of Charlotte, on the other hand, is probably not really money, but to prevent the birth of another Dhampir, a half-breed like himself, and this is definitely a sign of self-hatred. The blood here is probably the most gruesome animated plasma I've ever seen, though the shootout at the beginning of Akira is pretty fluid. But in the movie, it reminds me of Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. Another thing that became more clear as I watched the movie for the making of this video is that in spite of narrative facts that attempt to portray Link as a respectable noble, I don't see him as that great of an individual since, as a vampire, he clearly had fed on humans. But I will admit that he was wise enough to not want to inflict that curse on Charlotte. Another experience I got by paying much closer attention to the plot is confusion. That is, in a scene where Link stopped himself for the second time from turning Charlotte, if I understand correctly, she said some time ago villagers fired weapons at them because they saw the carriage and recognized it as a transport for a vampire. In an impulsive response out of anger, Mario Link attacked all of them, turning them into vampires. So I believe these are the very same people who attacked the Marcus brothers at the beginning of the film. I could not find information online that confirmed my theory here, but it seems to make sense. So when Charlotte told Leela that Link had not killed anyone, is it a circumstance where she was lying, or was she just being literal? That is, in a sense that when Link turned the village into vampires, technically he had not killed anyone. This is another question with no answer from any of the sources I searched. Upon release, the friend who introduced the film to me pointed out that every time a colony of bats was present on screen, it was Carmilla keeping an eye on everything happening to the characters. So she was prepared for all of her visitors during the third act. At the end, Charlotte does seem out of sorts, and looking at what happened to Borgoff, she should have turned evil since she was also bitten by Carmilla. Clearly she was not evil, but her state is clearly questionable, and I wish both of these circumstances had been explained. When D delivers the final blow, the camera zooms in on this element. It's never shown before, and clearly it's meant to represent Carmilla, but I don't know what it is exactly. Why would the Marcus brothers fire at the carriage if they are trying to capture Charlotte? This is something that I've seen so many times in anime and entertainment in general. For example, in the Plastic Little anime, the villains were trying to get a hold of a girl, Elise, and in spite of this, they continued to fire on vehicles they were sure carried her inside. It's cliché at this point, and it's really ridiculous. I've mentioned this issue in my Evangelion Thrice Upon a Time video. It's the odd practice of having some scenes produced at 12 frames per second and others at the full standard 24 frames per second. I can see how there are more frames when it comes to action scenes, but the inconsistency feels odd. I detest the trope of Western villages set in the future. I've lost count how many times I've seen this done in Star Trek, whether it's actually a setting on another planet or a simulation, but it's a concept I feel needs to be retired. In this film, we have a village salesman of horses with a standard looking sheriff, and again at the funeral at the end, it's the little house on a prairie. I'm confused as to where the lightning came from to blast Carolyn out of existence, right in the nick of time, to Deus Ex Machina Layla out of danger. Apparently it's just a coincidence resulting from the incoming storm, very convenient. D is essentially Blade, someone who denies their bloody nature. But he is even in a worse state, since he has to bury himself to recover from exposure, a cool element that I praise writer Hideyuki Kikuchi for. I guess the equivalent for Blade was his medication. Probably a bit picky here, but the industrial design and a bit of the castle design looks like a result of an unusual mixture of 18th century with space technology. It's a little reminiscent of 40K Hammer, and as far as this rocket is concerned, Carmilla says, whether it will fly or not, I don't even know. It's a bit much to think that this vehicle has been there perhaps for some years without a staff to maintain it and to operate it during flight. Also, when Carmilla mentioned the City of the Night, if that location is in a bad state, as her words were, it's in ruins these days without anyone to visit it, I wonder if it's the remnants seen floating in orbit at the beginning of the story. If that is the case, the events after the end of the movie are Charlotte out of sorts, possibly affected by Carmilla's bite, accompanied by Meyer Link, in a severely old and damaged orbiting station with no one to greet them when they arrive. Pretty bleak. Anyhow, I certainly did not want to end on a dire conclusion, so let me again state that this is my favorite anime of all time, with Thrice Upon a Time at a close second spot. The others on the list are certainly too numerous to go into, but epics such as Fantasia, 2001's Metropolis, the rest of the Evangelion Rebuild series, and some episodes of The Animatrix are on that extensive list. Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust is timeless, is a work of art, and still holds up to this day.